Jonas Nick, who will be speaking about ready-to-use distributed key generation.
Thanks, Lenka. All right. Yeah, so this talk is about distributed key generation in the context of threshold signatures. In practice, implementing threshold signatures and distributed key generation has required a lot of guesswork because of unavailable, insufficient, and complicated definitions. I am going to talk about how this has led to real-world vulnerabilities and present a solution, a DKG protocol for frost threshold signatures with ready-to-use specification. This is joint work with Tim Ruffing. First, let's briefly recall what threshold signatures are. In a T of n threshold signature scheme, any T signers out of a set of n signers can collaboratively produce a valid signature. And importantly, T-1 signers should not be able to produce a signature. The primary application we are interested in is in the Bitcoin space, and there is quite a range of applications. For example, in Bitcoin, you can use threshold signatures to secure a personal wallet, for example, with a 2 of 3 hardware wallet setup. And that way, you don't lose access to your coins if one device is lost. Threshold signatures can also be used in more complex setups, like wallets split across multiple entities that are connected through some network and where the signing keys are stored on highly available servers. Because we are primarily interested in Bitcoin applications, we focus on a very specific kind of threshold signature, namely the kind that works directly with the standard Schnorr verification function that is supported on Bitcoin. This function expects an ordinary Schnorr public key. So if we want to use threshold signatures in this setting, we need to generate that public key using an interactive distributed key generation protocol, a DKG between the signers. The function also expects an ordinary Schnorr signature, and producing such a Schnorr signature for the threshold public key requires an interactive signing protocol. The benefit of Schnorr-compatible threshold signatures is that they're indistinguishable from ordinary signatures on the Bitcoin blockchain. That means there's no privacy loss or extra transaction fees when using threshold signatures. The state-of-the-art scheme for Schnorr-compatible threshold signing is FROST. FROST stands for Flexible Round-Optimized Schnorr Threshold Signatures, originally proposed by Komlo and Goldberg, and since refined by several follow-up works. Round optimized here means that Frost only needs 2 rounds of communication for signing, and crucially, Frost does not require the majority of signers to be honest. So it supports dishonest majority settings for unforgeability. And this is important because requiring an honest majority would exclude a 3 of 4 setup, for example. That's because in a 3 of 4 setup, we assume up to T-1 equals 2 signers to be dishonest, but that means there are only 2 remaining honest signers, and that is not a majority. Okay, so this sounds all very promising, but when we look around, we see that there are almost no real-world deployments of this. And why is that? So let's take a step back and look at what we can call the idealized real-world crypto stack. Layers from bottom to top are papers and security proofs, standards and specifications, implementations, and deployments. For Frost signing, we have established papers with thorough proofs such as the original Frost paper and follow-up works. There's also a high-quality specification of Frost in the form of an IRTF RFC. And there is a growing list of implementations of Frost. So this specific collection of implementations was already presented at RWC 2 years ago. So there is a spec and there are implementations, but there are very few deployments 5 years after Frost's publication. So our thought was, Let's increase adoption by implementing Frost with distributed key generation in our Bitcoin crypto library, because this is a library that Bitcoin devs are already familiar with. By the way, that library is called SecP256K1ZKP, and it's a fork of the library used in Bitcoin Core and supports more advanced primitives. As we've seen before, if we want to implement the entirety of Frost, we don't only have to implement signing, but also distributed key generation. So the natural place for starting an implementation would be to look at the Frost RFC. We cannot use the Frost RFC directly because the Bitcoin protocol uses some optimizations that are incompatible, but that's no big deal. We could account for that. The problem is that the RFC considers key generation, and in particular distributed key generation, out of scope. So it's just not specified. And going back to our cryptography stack, for the DKG part of Frost, there are papers and security proofs, but there's no specification. So you now realized, okay, this project will take more work, but okay, let's implement the DKG as defined in the papers. What does DKG for Frost look like? There are, of course, many DKG protocols in the literature, but for full compatibility with Frost, we narrow our focus to protocols that support dishonest majority settings, and the DKG should work in an asynchronous network. And with these requirements, we are basically left with variants of PETPOP, Patterson DKG with proofs of possession, which was originally designed for Frost. It runs in 2 communication rounds, and while it's not a general purpose DKG, it has been proven secure in combination with Frost. All right, so when you want to implement the PETPOP DKG as described in the Frost paper, you will find that the DKG requires sending messages between signers using a reliable broadcast protocol. So what does that mean exactly? There are countless flavors of broadcasts whose security and availability guarantees differ slightly, sometimes significantly, and often subtly. The first thing the implementer needs to realize is that reliable broadcast is more than just regular network broadcast, and there is no obvious lightweight or off-the-shelf implementation for such a broadcast, especially one that supports a dishonest majority setting. Okay, so the implementer needs to build a broadcast protocol themselves. So first attempt, vibe coding. If you haven't come across this term yet, this refers to relying almost entirely on artificial intelligence for coding. I tried various experiments with current ChatGPT models and found that ChatGPT interprets reliable simply as guaranteed message delivery and overlooks malicious senders entirely. So if we would use such a broadcast protocol coded by ChatGPT, the resulting DKG would be horribly broken. Right, second attempt, do more research. And what you may find is documentation from a Frost signing implementation, and it instructs users to provide a suitable broadcast channel themselves in order to run the DKG. It lists a bunch of informal properties the broadcast channel is supposed to have. I'm not going to go through them here, but the bottom line is the implementation asks the user to find or implement a broadcast protocol that satisfies a set of rather imprecise requirements. Now, the really sad state of affairs is that even if you interpreted those requirements correctly, the resulting DKG protocol is still broken because one crucial requirement is missing, and let's take a look at why exactly. So this diagram depicts part of a 2 of 3 PETPOP DKG. I haven't described at all how PETPOP works, but I hope you can bear with me anyway. The only important part here is that in this protocol, it is possible for a malicious participant to send valid message to one signer and an invalid message to another signer. The signer who receives the valid message believes the DKG succeeded and might go ahead and send actual money to the resulting public key, for example, using the Bitcoin protocol. But the other signer who received the invalid message considers the DKG to have failed. So what's the result? In this 2 of 3 setup, 2 signers are either malicious or have failed. There's only 1 signer left, which is not enough to produce a signature. And that means that the coins sent to the public key are lost forever. So let's recap. Our goal was implementing Frost with DKG. But even if you carefully study the Frost papers, obtain the right definitions for the flavor of broadcast needed, interpret them accurately, and correctly implement broadcast, secure channels, and the DKG protocol itself, the result is still broken. And the solution that we propose is ChillDKG. ChillDKG is a protocol and a specification designed specifically for Frost and with all the hard parts built in, like reliable broadcasts, secure channels, and all the little edge cases that are easy to miss. And we're going to very briefly walk through how ChillDKG solves the problems we've just seen. The design of ChillDKG is based on simple PET-POP, which is a variant of the original PET-POP protocol. One main difference is that simple PET-POP replaces the broadcast abstraction used in PET-POP with an interactive equality check protocol, EQ. The EQ protocol takes some input and either succeeds or fails. Simple PET-POP requires two properties from EQ, which I state informally here. Integrity, if some honest signer succeeds, then the input values of all honest signers are equal. And agreement, if some honest signer succeeds, then eventually all honest signers will succeed. So how does the EQ protocol that is specified in ChillDKG actually work? This protocol is a signed variant of a very simple echo broadcast protocol. Here's how it works. Everyone signs their input and sends the signature to everyone else. And when a signer receives valid signatures from all n signers, this signer's EQ succeeds. So extremely simple. And this satisfies integrity because if a signer succeeds, they hold signatures from everyone on the same input, meaning that every honest signers had the same input. What about the agreement property? From the protocol description, we can see that whenever a signer's EQ succeeds, they've collected signatures from all other signers, and we call this list of signatures certificates, or a certificate. And that certificate can be sent to another signer to make them succeed too. And fortunately, this satisfies exactly the agreement requirement that we need. Now, back to simple PET-POP, it has the important property that if there's agreement in this EQ protocol, then there's also an agreement in the DKG as a whole. And that means if one participant in the DKG succeeds, they can convince every honest participant to succeed as well. And this directly prevents the failure mode we saw earlier, where an adversary could trick one signer into thinking the DKG succeeded while the others fail, which led to a loss of funds. And this works in an asynchronous setting and does not require an honest majority. ChillDKG comes with a bonus feature that makes it even more practical. We extend the input to the EQ protocol with essential parts of the transcript of the DKG protocol. And the difficulty here is to keep the size of the input in O of n. We solve that using homomorphic encryption and other aggregation techniques. But the crucial part is that then this extended input and the certificate allows any signer to recover their DKG outputs from a single per device secret seed, for example, when the device is wiped or broken. And what this means is that the per DKG backup is just public data, namely the input and certificate, instead of secret data, which is what you would usually have to back up from a DKG. And we believe that this significantly simplifies backing up Frost signing keys because the recovery data is the same for all participants and it can be stored by an untrusted third party. All right, to wrap up, takeaways. DKG is integral to Frost, but securely implementing it has been notoriously challenging. And one reason is that unclear requirements, especially around broadcast, lead to subtle and sometimes devastating vulnerabilities. ChillDKG provides a ready-to-implement specification that addresses these issues, and it offers more practical features that we didn't have time to cover. The full specification is available at this URL, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Feedback is very welcome. And last but not least, we are hiring. So if you're interested in cryptography on Bitcoin, and I can assure you that there are many interesting, real-world, open problems on Bitcoin still, and you could imagine working with us, then please reach out. All right, thanks for your time.
We have some time for questions. Maybe while you think about, let me ask one. So what would you say, what could the community have done better to prevent some of the issues that you have found in your journey?
So I guess one of the original problems was perhaps that the requirements in the paper on the broadcast, they were never really clear. It was sort of hand-waved away. And maybe if that had been stated more clearly, that would have already been helped. But I think maybe it just takes time for a relatively complicated interactive protocol like Frost to transition into the real world, because you really need those specifications that are open and that people can look at and see if they actually break, because there are many edge cases where things can fail.
Thanks.
So for the case of multi-sig wallets that are like 1 of 2 or 2 of 3, are people always using a DKG, or do people just use the model where like one factor generates the key and sends shares to the other, and it's secure as long as they're not all hacked when you start?
Sorry, I don't really understand.
Well, it's like you don't necessarily need a DKG to set up a multi-sig wallet. Some people just generate a key, kind of just have one factor of the 3 generate the secret key and then send shares to the other.
You mean the traditional multi-signature model in Bitcoin where you have multiple public keys?
No. Even with a thresholded key, you just generate the shares centrally, right, on your phone or whatever your second factor. Like
the trusted dealer model.
Yeah,
is that what you're referring to?
Trusted dealer, perfect. Yeah. Is that still like popular for threshold wallets, or is this?
I'm not sure if people actually do this, but it seems like it would defeat the point, right? Because then you have your single point of failure. If the trusted dealer is,
I guess it's only a single point of failure during the setup. So
right.
Yeah, so it's better than nothing, right?
Right. Yeah. So that part is kind of specified in the RFC. It's in the appendix.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, great talk. This is really important. We also had issues with this, so I'm glad that you're working on standardizing this. My question is, for DKG, you also need to encrypt the message, right? So I'm wondering if 2DKG also specifies how the encryption is done.
Excuse me, sorry, I couldn't hear it.
Does 2DKG also specifies how the encryption?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, ChillDKG specifies that. So one way to think about ChillDKG is that it's sort of built in 3 layers. On the bottom you have simple PETPOP, which doesn't specify any encryption. And then on top of that, we build what we call EncPETPOP, which specifies how to do the secure channels. And on top of that, you have ChillDKG, which adds this equality check protocol. So
cool.
Yeah, it should be ready to use, including the secure channels.
Cool. On top of that, I have a suggestion. Some uses of Frost also requires encrypting the message for the signing.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be good to also have a kind of standard, which I guess would be like probably the same thing from the 2DKG, that how to encrypt and authenticate the message during signing, not during the DKG. I guess you could just reuse the same structure.
Yeah, you might not be able to use this DKG for different protocols, because it's not a general purpose DKG. It's not simulatable. One signer can bias the result, but it works for Frost.
Yeah, thank you.
Let us thank the speaker again.